All right, so you'll have your mat down always when you start to work. Other things I have available to me are my tools. I've got my cup of water, and then I've got my pinch pot, which I made slip in earlier. So as I get started, I'm just going to put a little bit of water in there so it can start working on that slip while I start working on the project. Okay, that's my to-do list. And here's my clay. So you should have, this is a little more than a pound. Pare some of this down. You should have about a pound left. The only thing we used was a bit to make your pinch pot. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is, so you can see my sketch, we're gonna work in basic forms. So we wanna kind of simplify our sketch down, and we wanna build these basic three-dimensional forms that we can attach together. There's a couple ways you can do that. So we talk about additive and subtractive sculpting, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second. So some people like to build, it's hard to see, some people like to build the body and then like all of these things are added on, like legs and arms and such, okay? But what I'm actually gonna do is kind of build this as one large shape, more of like just this gumdrop shape, and then show you how to subtractively take away and form these feet, okay? Which will make sense in a second. So from your hunk of clay, the first thing you want to do is separate off a little bit for your extremities and your appendages and things. So I want to separate enough off that I have clay for these arms. So I'm going to take off a couple hunks and a little bit more so that I can build this tail. And then I want to build only the body first, and that way you don't run out of clay. We will hollow it at the end, which will give you even more clay that most people usually use for all the little details and things. Okay, so there is a little bit more clay than what we have right here. All right, once we hollow it. So I'm going to start by shaping this basic form. So you can either use the palm of your hand, which gives you more of like a curve shape. I use my fingers and kind of pat the clay. You can use the table if you have more sharper lines, like more like a rectangle. Okay, and you're trying to get that basic shape down. It's going to be a little bit lumpy, and that's pretty normal, but you want to try and pat down as many of those big lumps as you can, which will save you time on smoothing later. And I'm referencing my sketch. You can see my sketch is out on my table, and I do that when I'm working because if you rely on your brain as the only source to sculpt from, you're going to end up with a potato. Okay, it's just, your brain really needs a reference image. It's the best practices. All right, so that's kind of what I'm going for, okay? And then I'm going to move on and start to build these other pieces. Let me show you my example from earlier today. So this is what I kind of got done. We're going for something like this. So I built this body shape first and then built this head separate and attached it together. So depending on how complex your body shape is, it might be made of multiple components. And that's totally fine. All right, but in this case, I'm just gonna move on to this little guy here. I'm gonna move on to my arms, and then you'll be able to see how we attach clay, which is probably the most important skill from this project. It's tied for 2. How do you attach things appropriately so that they don't fall apart when they dry? And secondly, how do you hollow things out so they don't explode, okay? So the hollowing I'll get to in a little bit, but the attachment let's tackle now. So these arms, I'm gonna roll them into kind of a coil shape and tap them. You can also sculpt things by pinching, which is like my other preferred method, or some people are more of like a, I don't know how to describe it, like schmearers. They kind of like to smooth the clay this way. All right, so you're going to be finding your own kind of sculpting method. I'm tapping against the table. You can use tools to kind of shape things. So if I maybe wanted this to be a bit narrower here and more like an elephant foot, I can take my loop tool and shave off some clay. That's subtractive sculpting, which we'll talk about more in a second. Okay. This step, though, is you're only sculpting. We're not using any water or anything to smooth, okay? If you introduce water at this point, you're gonna end up with a big slippy mess on the surface, all right? So I wanna stress that, no water at all. Okay, so I would shape my arm and then I wanna attach it here. So I'm gonna kind of figure out where I want it. In this case, I'm gonna taper it a little bit so that it blends better into the body instead of, we don't want things to just look like they were stuck on. On the human body, like where two things meet, or like your joint at your shoulder, okay, it's a nice smooth transition. Or where your neck meets your body, there's no corners, okay? So you want the same thing in most cases for your sculpture, to have a nice smooth transition. Okay, so I figured out where I want it. Now how do I attach it? Ta-da! Rib. All right. You need to score. Score really, really well with the rib. No, not with a needle tool. That's not scoring. That's drawing stuff on the clay. Okay? You're going to create a really rough surface on both pieces. So I'm going to score that. And notice how I did a pretty large space, not just this end piece. Okay? Think of this like Velcro. This, if I have two flat surfaces and I try and rub them, try and not let them move, I can still move them. But if I have two rough surfaces that interlock, there's no way those things are moving. It's like Velcro. All right, so that's when you're doing this scoring step, that's what you're trying to create, is that Velcro scenario. So I'm gonna score that, and I'm gonna score where I wanna attach it on the body. If you overscore, like larger than you need, it's okay, we'll smooth it out. All right, more is better. And then, in your pinch pot, you can swirl your brush around, and you should have a chocolate milk kind of consistency of slip that I'm gonna add on. I only slip one piece, okay, because I don't like it to be too slippy so that it's like moving around. Just want it to be slippy enough to attach. This slip also acts not only as a glue, but it fills all of these little cracks and prevents them from being like air pockets, and those air pockets could hold extra moisture, and we know that moisture, when it's heated, if there's any moisture left when it's heated in the kiln, will turn to steam and cause it to explode. So that's what we're trying to avoid, and we want even drying, okay? So what I'm gonna do is kind of press it together, and then I'm gonna wiggle it back and forth so I get that Velcro action to happen. Okay, so it really sticks on there. And then I'm gonna go back in and blend the two together. You can do that with your finger. My preferred tool, and why I put it in your kit, is this wooden modeling tool that has like a thumb-shaped end, is my favorite. Because what I can do is go back in here and blend this clay into the body. The other part of this project is you're figuring out what are your favorite tools to use and what kind of works best for you. The same tool isn't going to work for everybody. And I'm going to even go in this seam here, and I'm going to use the side of my tool, and I'm going to smooth, kind of blend this out. So, and then the other end of your tool should have a flat end that you can also use. You're getting good practice. So it looks something like that. So notice there's no extra slip squishing out. There's no extra marks. I've cleaned all of that up. And you do the same thing on the back. Smooth it all out. So every single time you attach something, no matter how large or small it is, you must score and slip, and we refer to this as stitching. So like kind of making sure it's really sewn together, so to speak, okay? Let's see here. So we shaped our basic form, we score, slip, and stitch, we blended and smoothing. One other thing about blends on things is sometimes, let's say, I'm gonna flip this over and do it on the back. Let's say I didn't want there to be kind of this seam here. That would be like his armpit kind of. But let's say I didn't want that and I wanted it to be a perfectly smooth blend from body to arm. This also, this technique we also use if we have joints that are weak, like tails and things like that. This adds strength to the joint. All right, so what I want to do is in that joint there, I'm going to put a little bit of slip. Scratch this coil. And I'm going to press, I don't need that much, press the coil into the seam that you want to smooth out. I did this on this example between the head and the body so that you get a nice transition between the two. So you take that coil and you just press it into the seam. And then I take the thumb end here and I can, modeling tool, and I can spread, almost like you're kind of blending half the coil to the arm and half the coil to the body. And then I go over it with my finger, and that will create, kind of fill the seam seamlessly. Yeah. And then create a nicer transition. So between like necks and bodies, that's the kind of thing you want to do. There's lots of different applications for that, okay? So that's transition, and that's leaving a clean but noticeable seam, all right? So all of those things are additive. Anything you're slipping on would be additive, a form of additive sculpting. But there is this thing called subtractive, which would be the opposite, and is another really useful way to look at shaping your clay. So subtractive, obviously I'm going to remove clay. So I'm going to use a loop tool. You can use, I don't remember if there's a big one or a little one in your kit, to be honest. This, whoops. Your dentist tool is also great for this, or even your modeling tool. But you're going to kind of use the loop tool, and I'm going to remove clay to create definition like between parts of my sculpture. So if I want to define this as like 2 feet versus like a gumdrop shape, I'm going to come in here with my loop tool and start removing some of this clay to create the form I want. And your loop tool should have an end that has kind of a flatter edge and an end that is rounded. And play around with both of those because they'll give you obviously different shapes, and you'll likely get to a point where you gravitate towards one of them, one shape on that tool more than the other. So play around with both of them. Notice how I'm sticking all of these little pieces back to my hunk of clay. So that they don't dry out and turn into crusties. I want to be able to use this clay to make something for my monster, and so I keep sticking all the little extra bits on there. You can even put this back in your bag while you wait, and then it'll stay really, really nice and plastic. Okay, so I'm working subtractively to take away some of this clay, and then after I do that, I kind of go back and I shape with either my finger or a modeling tool, so I can press in here and start to create like, a crease between his body and his foot, and start to define kind of more interesting shapes on this form. Kind of create definition between the feet and the body. Remember, you want complex bodies here, all right? Not simple shapes. All right, let's see what else. The other thing, you might have kind of like wrinkles or tufts of hair or hunks of hair. So like on this guy, I want the hair to flare out. I haven't really determined a texture on him, but let's say I want hair to flare out at the bottom. That would be another additive thing that I would sculpt on. So Put a little slip on here at the bottom. Score. Some people score first and then slip, and then some people slip first and then score. It's up to you. And then I'm going to add some of my clay here to build out that body at the bottom and create kind of like fur tufts that like lay on the floor a little bit. Make sure that you score the body and you have slip on there. Okay, and this additive process, we want to do this, I kind of do this all on day one. That's why we focus on getting those basic shapes down first, because once we move forward, you only want to attach, you really want to try to attach clay that is the same stage of dryness, same plasticity, same level of wetness. Okay, if this is getting really leather hard because I've been working on it for a week and I pull plastic clay out of my bag and try and attach it on here, that is going to complicate attaching those two pieces even more, okay? And they're more likely to crack because they will dry at different rates. So I really try and get those attachments done sooner rather than later. It doesn't mean that you can't attach things on day 2 or day 3, but it does mean that scoring and slipping is so important. And it's already important. All right. So you can kind of change the shape with some additive sculpting as well. All right. What's my time like? 11:05. I'm good. Oh, time flies when you're making clay. Okay. Let's briefly discuss hollowing, and then if I can get to the texture, that would be great. Okay, so I've talked a lot about not exploding things in the kiln. Things explode when there's moisture hiding in the clay. Okay, this is thick, okay, and would take forever to dry. So how do we speed that process up? Well, probably gave you a clue. It has something to do with hollowing. We are going to try and remove as much of this interior clay as we can to allow air to go in there and dry the clay out. So we're going to use our loop tool. I first start by kind of creating a guideline for myself. So we want the clay to be about, or no thicker than rather, the thickness of your pinky. Okay? For the pinch pots, we did the pencil tool, and that's just because they're so tiny. So we made them a little thinner. But no thicker than your pinky. So I'm drawing myself a guideline to start at the bottom with my loop tool. And then I'm going to scoop out a little at a time. You don't want to go too thin to the wall because your monster is going to become kind of unstable. The walls will be really thin and they'll start to kind of mush, okay, and not hold their form. All right, so I don't want to take too much, don't want to take too much out. So I'm going to work my way down into the clay, all right, a little at a time, adding the hunks back onto my ball of clay so they don't dry out. If you go through the wall, you can patch it from the inside with some of this soft clay. That's fine. You know from the pinch pots how to measure thickness with your needle tool if you're not sure. So I can, look in here, I can poke my needle tool in until I see it pop through. I can put my finger on the outside on the needle tool and hold it and don't move your hand, and then slide it out, and then I can see how thick that clay is there. So you can really measure as you go if you're a little nervous, and you just work your way all the way up into the gargoyle or monster. So I'd have to go all the way up here, the pinky's lit from the top, so I have a while to go. And that's quite a bit of extra clay that I can then use for all my little details. My little fur fluffs, the little pads on their feet, coils on their horns, little tufts of hair, eyes, teeth, like trick them out. Put as much detail on these as you can. Trust me, you'll be much happier with the outcome. All right, so that's hollowing. Once you're done hollowing, I do smooth this edge out with my finger, or you can dip your finger in a little bit of water and go back and forth. That's what's going to sit on the table or the surface. I'm going to assume that you're going to all display these at home once you make them because you'll love them so much and keep them for years. Okay, so you don't want there to be a rough edge that will scrape up your table. Let's go back and smooth this. But I have a while to go in there for this to be completely hollowed out. I have to keep working on that. In the case of this guy, or if you have any thin, like, appendages, okay, what we can do is poke holes, like, up through the bottom discreetly, or if we have, I can show you how to cut them and hollow them and reattach them if they're really thick. This I would probably just poke a hole with my pencil tool through this. Okay. Up in it like that. And then if you wanted to put some clay over that, you just need a little hole for steam to get out. So that's a really obnoxiously large hole to have to design around, so I can attach that and do just a little tiny needle tool hole to let the steam out. Anywhere there's an opening has to have somewhere for the steam to get out. So like some people decide, oh, well, I'm going to hollow this awkwardly shaped head first and then attach it on. Great idea, okay? But then you need to have a steam hole. So if this were hollowed out before I attached it to the body, that's great. But I would have to make a little steam hole between the hollow body and the head. You can't trap any air. Okay? These are all things that I will probably, when we're meeting in class, at home, I will ask you these questions repeatedly, over and over and over again. Do you have a steam hole in there? Is that hollowed out? All of this stuff. So get used to that. Okay? And then from there is honestly like all the fun stuff. The texture, which I'm going to run out of time probably for all my texture ideas, and the little tiny details, teeth and things. If they're really small, they're going to be difficult to score, I'll be honest with you. Do your very best, okay? If I was going to attach little tiny teeth on here, your rib is going to be a little large, so I might come in here and just give myself a little bit of scoring, slip, and emphasize the wiggle. And then I like to take my blue brush with a little bit of water and just brush around it. That gets all the crusties and all the extra slip. This is basically the only smoothing you'll do. Don't really do any with the sponge. It's too much water and it becomes really slippy really quickly. So I'm just using a little bit of water here and brushing over any imperfections or like little crusties on the edges of things. Like that. As far as texture, play around with your tools. The most boring texture out of all of them is this. People are like, fur. Okay, well, fur doesn't all lay like that in the same direction. You know, you've got tufts of it or hunks of fur. So play with some of your other tools. What I kind of do is I lay down almost like a base texture. So I would use the rib, and then I go back with some of my other tools and make some kind of like some deeper lines, some kind of tufts of clay, hunks of hair. And then I like to brush over my designs with that little bit of water, so it takes off the kind of rough little crusties, but it doesn't remove your actual texture. If I sponged over this, it would be very slippy and a hot mess, and you'd also wipe away quite a bit of that texture. Think about patterns, like especially scales, the end of your pencil tool. Basically, any mark that you can repeat will create a really cool pattern, and therefore, three-dimensional pattern is texture. So I can create scales by repeating things. I can use different shaped tools to create repeating textures.